Hello all, I'm so pleased to welcome you to Land by Design. This is the fifth in our Pratt Provocations lecture in our land infrastructure series this fall semester. And really happy to welcome Dilip da Cunha and Anuradha Mathur to speak about the relationship between water and the land. We haven't really throughout the semester, we've been so focused on land and infrastructure and haven't really yet turned to the water. And I think this is such an important conversation to have as part of the series this semester. So I'll turn it over to Katherine Ingram, who will be introducing and moderating this evening. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Just to introduce the two speakers, Anuradha Mathur is an architect and landscape architect. She's professor emeritus at Weizmann School of Design at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And Dilip da Cunha is an architect and planner, adjunct professor at Columbia University. He has previously taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Parsons School, and Harvard University. He's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship for 2020, not too shabby, I would say. Congratulations on that, that's enormous. So we're going to start, the format is that we're going to start with a presentation by our two speakers who are incredibly interesting. They have been co-authors for a number of books, the Mississippi Floods book in 2001, Deccan Traverse, The Making of Bangalore's Terrain, 2006, Soak, Mumbai in an Estuary, 2009, and co-editors of Design in the Terrain of Water in 2014. These books accompanied major public exhibitions that form an intrinsic part of Mathur and da Cunha's practice. Da Cunha is also author of a new book now, The Invention of Rivers, Alexander's Eye, and Ganga Descent in 2019. And in 2017, Mathur and da Cunha launched Ocean of Wetness, a design platform that seeks to situate the past, present, and future of habitation in a ubiquitous wetness rather than on a land-water surface. All of this is incredibly fascinating and very pertinent to what we're thinking about today, and very timely in its arrival, just as the landscape architecture program is being launched at Pratt, and also really very provocative in its, in its research and thinking. So I think it'll be terrific. We're just very lucky to be able to hear what they're working on. And then there'll be a short quote. I wanted to tell you that if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And Aisha, who is also here as a MArch student in the third year from Pratt Institute, is going to help with gathering those questions, and Laura too. And then we'll have a little bit of a response after the presentation, and then we'll be opening for questions, everybody's questions. So please log your questions in as we go along. Great, so please. You can start. Do you need to? Oh,
we need a share screen, so I just wondered if, yeah.
Is it set up to share screen?
Okay.
Yes, and I just made you co-host, so you should be able to share screen.
Perfect.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Okay, can you all see that now?
Yes,
we can.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Katherine and Laura and everybody else who's been part of this invitation. We were really excited to talk, to you all and to students at Pratt. I mean, we think of New York as being our next door neighbor, and just to engage with the school there, which I think we haven't, is a wonderful opportunity. So what we would like to do today is to share our very current thinking in terms of design but as I think you mentioned, Katherine, in terms of land and water. It's really about how do we start to articulate these things and where for us the problem actually lies in what we are facing today. So what we're going to do is start with Dilip, who's going to set the stage for what we think of as a new paradigm. And then we'll both share, the conversation, in our presentation in sort of demonstrating it through our past work, but also through what is work in progress currently. And, is not quite developed, but, we want to sort of bring it on through the table.
Okay. So I want to begin by, talking about something that is very current and in all our faces. I mean, we all face, I guess the world faces several crises today, that are of, considerable significance. But there's one in particular that is holding center stage, and that is climate change. And today, it is uppermost, primarily because of the COP26 that is happening in Glasgow. Now, the world is gathered over there to discuss, issues that are associated with climate change, such as sea level rise, immigration, increasing storm events, erratic rains, and so on. Now, these are problems that are attributed to climate change. Now, the way we want to look at it is, is climate change the problem? Or is climate change a symptom of a design paradigm, of a land-centric design paradigm that is at the base of much of the way we think about habitation and really about the ground of design. This is a design paradigm that creates land by asserting a surface to separate atmosphere from earth, and then drawing a line to separate land from water. In other words, what I'm saying is that we live on land by design, and not all indigenous people, I would say, believed or saw themselves living on an earth surface that was divided between land and water. So ours is to some extent an exploration of an alternative to the land-water surface. But this particular paradigm requires a certain dissection. And so allow me to take you through how this paradigm sets itself up. In other words, how do we design land, or how do we bring land into the world, as it were, creating it as a ground of design. So I want to start by stating something that should be obvious to all of us, because I think we're all born into it. We're born into a world with wetness everywhere, because wetness is everywhere. It's in rain, it's in flora, it's in fauna, it's in soil, it's in rocks, it's in sea, it's in lakes, it's in humidity, it is literally everywhere. We live in wetness. In other words, there is no such thing as dryness. There's only less wet and more wet. The question then that follows from this is, how did we get from wetness everywhere to water somewhere? And that is a majestic act of design. So we start with wetness, the wetness that is really from clouds to aquifers, and we're inhabiting this zone. We call it a critical zone of wetness. We insert a surface. Now, this is what all surveyors do, and this is what all of us as designers do. And we do it unconsciously. To some extent, all students of geography and all of us educated. So right from our, from the time we're born, we're educated into a paradigm that asserts a surface. Now, when I talk about a surface, I'm talking about something with no depth, something that separates but does not bring attention to itself because it has no depth. So it literally is the map on the surface, I mean, on the earth, separating earth below from atmosphere above. So what this surface does is it really creates a zone of air and it creates a zone of earth. Now, this may seem very obvious to you, but I would encourage you to ask any indigenous person, a person not educated in geography at this point, when you tell them, that, there's water under the surface or there's something under the surface, they're definitely going to ask you, well, what do you mean under the surface? What do you mean by under the surface? This is something that we all presuppose, and that is that there is some kind of sheet that we can look under, so that is a geometric concept. And not everybody shares this geometric concept. Now there is a second geometric concept that is then applied to the surface. And again, we do it unconsciously, and that is the line between land and water. So we separate land from water. We keep water then in its place. And then we, so that we have land that is drained of water to live on. So we all talk about land and water, but, we assume that there's this line separating the two. So with that line now in place, we can engineer water in a particular place. So what we say is, this is the ground that we see nature upon, right? We see nature upon an Earth's surface. We assume that animals, plants inhabit an Earth's surface, et cetera, et cetera. So all of ecology, all of nature has been constituted on the basis, on the ground of what we have designed. So in other words, this is now the language of landscape. So landscape exists by design, And so when you manipulate something like this, you're actually, you're manipulating what has already been brought onto a platform of design. So basically, that's the way we've got from wetness everywhere to water somewhere. But there is a time to this, and I want to introduce this because this is actually very important. There is a time to this design, and this time I want to lay out on the basis of the hydrologic cycle. I'm sure you're all familiar with the hydrologic cycle. This is a very complex cycle that is designed by James Houghton in I think it was 1930s or so. He was a hydrologist, and so you can sort of see the complexity. But what the hydrologic cycle does is that it tells us that water circulates. Water has places and water has states. So it moves from liquid to vapor and to solid state. And so it sublimates, it osmotes, it permeates, it precipitates, and so on and so forth. But always with a sense of the possibility of returning to some former state or place. So that is the hydrologic cycle. And we've been living with this hydrologic cycle from, for millions and billions of years. In other words, water has not been created in any sense of the term, and it has been the same water that is circulated and that is ongoing in circulation. I want to see this and show you this sort of simplified version of it in 4 states. This is Paul Clay's drawing of the hydrologic cycle with the precipitation. So that's the first, number 1. Flow formation, on the Earth's surface is 2. Then you have evaporation from the surface to the clouds, and then you have cloud formation, and then back to precipitation. Now, this is a simplified version, but it is sufficient for us to actually make the point that what we do is we inhabit one of these moments. And this becomes a moment of reality, the flow formation. In other words, when we make this the time of reality, we make all other moments ephemeral. So in other words, rain becomes a visitor. Humidity, dew, all these become visitors. Now they become ephemeral moments. So we have a time of reality and we have moments of ephemerality. So in other words, by privileging this moment of time, by living in this moment of time, we are able to actually control the place of water. So what I like to say is that a surveyor, when they go out to draw a map, they don't go out when it's raining. They go out when it stops raining. They go out when there's fog has risen. is not on the ground, so they can see clearly. So in other words, what they produce then, and what we all then work with as designers, is a fair weather landscape. It's not just landscape, it is a fair weather landscape. So it's a landscape that has been constructed in a moment of clarity. And in that moment of clarity, we're able to control all other moments of ephemerality through controlling events. So in other words, when a hurricane comes, we define it as an event in time. So with a surface, by positing an Earth's surface, we have constructed the measures of time and space. We've constructed the measures of time and space. So we can control water in events like hurricanes, like snowstorms and so on. And we control water in place, in a particular space by putting it, within two lines or within a line. So even when you produce maps by satellites, you don't work with an image like this. You wait for the clouds to pass and to get a clear image actually of the Earth's surface. So in other words, this is just a demonstration actually of fair weather, and the construction then of a weather event that disrupts this clarity of image. So we have to, as designers, just think about this moment of time that we have chosen in which to design and to construct reality. So when we look at these, we do not see climate change. What we see is actually wetness reasserting its place everywhere. And that is the thing that we have taken control of wetness when perhaps we shouldn't. Maybe we should be more accommodating of wetness. So what we want to suggest is another paradigm wherein we inhabit the hydrologic cycle in its entirety, not in a single moment that then allows us to take control of wetness as water somewhere. In other words, we've made wetness into land and water. Instead of that, let us inhabit the hydrologic cycle in its entirety, starting with the moment of precipitation. So this time, this time is a much more extended time that I'm talking about now for design. I'm also talking about an extended place of design, that we're not designing an Earth's surface alone, but what we are doing is we are inhabiting between clouds and aquifers. So think now that we have to design without an Earth's surface. And why I'm stating all this is that with climate change, it's the surface that is the problem. It's the surface that is drawing our attention. It's land that is asking to be rescued. But land has been our creation. It has been our creation. So we cannot solve the problem of land, water with the paradigm that has gone into creating the climate change problem. Now, this is something that has been said actually in Glasgow, which I much appreciate. Of course, it is Einstein who first said it, that we cannot solve problems, with a knowledge structure that has gone into creating them. We have to come up with another paradigm. And so this is what we're suggesting, that instead of inhabiting an Earth's surface, we inhabit a critical zone of wetness between clouds and aquifers, in which the whole hydrologic cycle plays a part. So here what we are talking about is two infrastructures. On the left, you see an infrastructure of control, where we are taking control of water. And now the latest sign of hubris, I think, of human hubris, is trying to take charge of the seas now. We want to control the sea, and keep it from flooding land, So there are all these initiatives starting in New York with rebuild design projects that are mostly levee projects, mostly projects that are aimed at keeping the sea out or taming the sea in some way, at least when it touches land. So we are working actually with a dry land model, and water that is controlled in that little bubble that you see on the left. And on the right, you have then another way of inhabiting now the critical zone between clouds and aquifers, between high grounds and low grounds. And this is something that we want to play out. So the question that we ask in our practice, this is really, how do we design in a critical zone of wetness? How do we begin to embrace ubiquitous wetness as the basis and the milieu of design, rather than a fair weather landscape that we stand upon where water has a place.
Thanks, Dilip. So in our practice, as Dilip just suggested, and as well as our teaching, we have traversed many places, and we find that wetness has actually spoken a unique language to us for a long time. And it was only recently that we started to recognize that, what we call water everywhere should really be wetness everywhere. Because the moment we start using the word water, we know that, when we say water, it's not land. And when we say land, it's not water, fundamentally in our minds. And that constructs a binary. And so to get into a sort of moment of sort of being in a sort of non-dualistic mode, how do we actually start to look back at some of our projects, but also look at what we are sort of pursuing now in our investigations and the work we are doing, which we call Ocean of Rain, has become something that we would, like to share with you a little bit. Some of you may be familiar with our work on Mumbai, as you mentioned earlier. This was sort of, one of the times we became most conscious of this divide between land and sea, and that how stark it was. And when you see the map on your left, you realize, it's a beautiful 1827 map with a lot of articulation, if we could zoom into it, about, pedestral information and, boundaries and, signatures and water bodies and everything. And the sea has almost nothing to say over here, and, except for titles and, creatures and other things. And it's been an imagination that has sort of, been built up over and over and over again, that everything we think about today is about land value, land use, land management. And many people would say that Mumbai has sort of fattened itself in many ways. So, this drawing on the left, on the right actually, was something that came very early in our process in our own work, where we started to sort of think, what would it mean to just imagine, rain and tide? If we try to think of rain and tide, we bring the sea and we bring rain that falls on the terrain in a kind of dialogue already, and sort of, and I wouldn't say soften the line, but I would say just sort of bring a presence that is not as stark, yet being aware that it exists. And what we are really talking about is also starting to see in section. So if if I had to go back to the image behind just for a second, it's a sectional drawing rather than starting to see a plan, even though it's a planometric, but it's much more sectional. So starting to see between clouds and aquifers, even though we were not quite aware of it in the time we were working on SoC, it was something that was already starting to work sort of in the imagination. And what we found is that, we were really pulling apart these two paradigms. On the left is a model that is, up, in a place just a few hundred miles from Mumbai, where, our version of the Army Corps really exists. And that's what they are imagining Mumbai's estuary to be, contain water and, and think about drainage. So it's all about draining land and creating land. And, what would it mean, we asked ourselves to imagine Mumbai in an estuary. And we're not only talking about parts which are, currently mangroves and open, literal wetlands, but the whole, sort of fabric of Mumbai sits on an estuary. It is an estuary. And, and the estuary speaks over and over again. And what is it to sort of starting to think about wetness everywhere rather than somewhere? And so, so rather than look at this island imagination, which is very much part of the marketing of Mumbai today, everything is about island city. It's about land and sea, surface and boundary. And to still finding, these moments where the estuary sort of speaks and it, it exists, in the monsoon, the tide, mangroves, in the rain. So without sort of going into too much detail, we just sort of want to open this whole issue of land moving in this direction of land use, so from larger sensibilities, it starts to also open up into the way we start to divide things. We might start to bring them back into multiple land uses, but we have to work with this whole act of separation, which is something we're thinking more and more, why do we begin design with the act of separation and then try and bring them back? Is there a way of bringing through negotiation? And if people have traveled to Mumbai and, sort of really got into the cracks and interstices of the place, you'll realize that there are, people live by negotiation. It's not black and white. There's a lot of transactional, world that you live in. And how do you actually start to work in design, thinking about, ways that don't have to, start in a plan, decide certain, categories, and then start to work. And, and we find that working in that way, working with these separations, we land up in situations like this. And this is not only, these are images of the 2005 flood, which was disastrous, but this is every monsoon. And, and even before people were talking about climate change, this was happening. And so the question that Dilip raised that, is this something to do with the way we imagine, the way we have already designed our infrastructure, or is it something new coming towards it? So government officials are all taking the refuge of climate change and saying this is something new. And we actually sit on this funny edge of starting to take, wanting them to take more responsibility of our past and our history as well. And, so as part of that larger project, we had really worked on, rather than defining entities, and on the left is a particular small little river called the Methi, starting to see Mumbai as a much wider open terrain, and proposed, 10 to 12 proposals, which worked with section, worked with time, worked with the idea of wetness, without going into them, just to give a sense of not beginning with plan, took us into a whole world of photo works, took us into a world of sections, but also time, because these sections are not drawn on the planimetric, they're really part of the walk, of the photo walk itself, and worked on it, but they also designed propositions, the notations, and sort of some of these practices which are part of Mumbai's life are very much woven into how we were thinking about design. So we were not only thinking about it spatially at one moment, but these notations, which are too small to see, but we don't want to spend the time in this presentation talking about those in detail. They actually start talking about living in the whole hydrological cycle rather than only at a particular moment. This really became a book and a public exhibition that is still, I think maybe it is more part of this generation that has starting to absorb it, even though we had many conversations with officials at that time. But our project really is and has been to change the larger imagination. And so we felt that, even though we could do demonstrative projects, the idea was to start thinking differently. And that takes time. And, we are also learning how to sort of accept that time. Having worked on Mumbai sort of brought us to, to the East Coast of the United States. And we were invited by a Rockefeller grant, which initiated in Princeton by Guy Nordenson, to actually work on the coast of Virginia. And what we had sort of started to sort of imagine, or started to sort of question the coastline as being a definitive line rather than a coast, really came to pass when we were sort of looking at this place after Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And really starting to think, why do we think of things as a coastline, in which you can only think about building barriers or, retreat, or sort of, sort of a kind of gradient of barriers. And if you sort of changed the imagination and started to think the other way, started to think perpendicular to the ocean, we at this point coined a term called fingers of high ground, which was also, from, looking at the coast itself, to actually starting to look at particular projects, starting to look at particular territories, from highways to geological features to certain, infrastructures that could actually start to think about working with high ground and low ground, both starting to speak a sectional language rather than starting to plan, literally. So we've worked on certain demonstrative projects. There's a whole website that is dedicated only to this project if anybody is interested. But Fingers of High Ground became a way of starting to think about wetness rather than thinking about water somewhere, because it's really about time and how these things act in time. But one thing which was really important is that it brought rain into conversation. So what we were doing is not only thinking about that we are sort of trying to confront the sea out there, we were really talking about rain, which is within. And if you know places like Norfolk, where we were working in, they are actually going under water, under wetness, because of the rain that is actually sort of getting trapped because of levee projects and other projects. And while we understand that it is important to build levees, to build some of these things in the short term, these are definitely not long-term projects. And I think even the Army Corps recognizes that. And so our larger endeavor really was, how do we work with tide and rain? And so this sort of photo work, which has certain strategies, on the left and on the right, starts to talk about the meeting of these worlds. And I think if you take that starting point, we found some very commonsensical, practical ways of starting to work in Norfolk, which are not even on the table. And this is what we found actually fascinating. And, so I'm not going to talk more about it, but I'm going to sort of go back. And I think we'll go back go forward into work we are doing now. And this is a work that, we started parallel to Dilip's book, the Invention of Rivers. And I would say the Invention of Rivers was the first part, and the Ocean of Rain is the second part. And we kind of split the project and decided we'll do it in two parts. It was too big to handle as a one sum.
Right. So, so this is, as Anu said, we're really more and more thinking that, it's as much of a design project to change the imagination, as sort of working on the ground. So while we work on the ground a lot, and then we do studios, et cetera, this change of imagination and how we start thinking about the place of design, has a very important role in the future. So since Anu spoke about the invention of rivers, that project questioned the line between land and water as a line that we take for granted as generally natural when there's nothing natural about it. So we don't see flood, for example, as a natural event. And it's amazing that for ecologists, flood is treated as a natural condition. And you have things like a floodplain. How the heck can you have flood? If you basically recognize the fact that you are the one drawing the line, we draw a line, we put water in its place. How can water flood as a natural event? It is by design. Flood exists by design. So for us not, to accept ecology without that critique, I find is mind-boggling, and we need to bring that. We need to bring this aspect, to ecologists and tell them, listen, don't fool us with this thing that this is some, animals live by flood cycles, for example. Flood cycles are our creation. We do it by design. We know how to draw lines, and and it's our business. Now, see, so there's a new role for designers to play that takes charge of even history, because so much of history has assumed flood. For example, so much of history has assumed rivers, as flows between two lines. These are all assumptions that have been made. So this paradigm has taken root, and I don't want to get into the history of it here, but in the book, I cover it. It's 2,500 years old. It was set up by the first scientists, who wanted a ground of observation. So they inserted a surface. So Ocean of Rain is really about the surface and how the surface has been inserted, not just the line drawn on the surface, but the surface itself has been conceived as an act of design, but to facilitate observation, to facilitate habitation, but above all, to facilitate the control of wetness as water. So Ocean of Rain focuses pretty much on India, and provides another whole view, actually, and understanding of India. So to give you the whole thesis in essence, if you will, there are two ways, there are two ways of seeing rain. One is rain, the predominant paradigm is the dominant paradigm that we all accept as designers, is that rain falls to a surface. As you see in this photo work, it falls to a surface, it forms flows. Those flows form rivers, so we've constructed those flows, we've mapped them, extensively over the past 2,000 years, and we basically articulated the Earth's surface, to drain through these rivers into the sea. So this is really a drainage paradigm that we can then take charge of these rivers and engineer them further, for drainage, for energy, for riverfront development, for transportation, and so on and so forth. So one of the products of this, articulation of rivers is the Indian subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. So we assume, I mean, you can see it here taking shape over the centuries, but the idea that there is a surface here, that surface can be represented in a map, like rivers can be represented in a map, because you've drawn them with lines, those lines can be redrawn. Remember, a line is without any breadth, it's only length, right? So you can change scales without deforming the shape of a river. I mean, that is what is remarkable about both the surface and the line. They're both geometric concepts that are totally, sort of products of the mind. There is a second paradigm that we don't hear about much, and that is when rain falls, it does not fall to a surface. It rather thickens a wetness that is already everywhere. Like I mentioned, in flora and fauna, in soils, in the air, and so on, in aquifers. So this is from clouds to aquifers. So the rain thickens this wetness, And this is not wetness that you see. This is wetness that you must engage. You have to engage in some form. And then this is not wetness that you can, this is not water that you can represent, like you represent rivers, on a map. This is a wetness that you must demonstrate. So we're challenging the very concept of representation, particularly in a place like India, which was once colonized, by European, colonizers, and presented to the people in a certain way through maps. Now, 90% of India does not know how to read a map still, they have to be educated into reading a map and then educated into representing their own place. So representation is a way of colonizing. So what we want to suggest over here is that the whole ground of wetness has been colonized by rivers and river thinking, been colonized by representation. So demonstration has been colonized by representation. So what we are now returning to in some ways, by engaging staining on paper, we are beginning to understand what it means for people to engage wetness in the soil, in plants, and so on, and so on, and so forth. Now, this is a world that doesn't take us to India. India is a classic example of a geographic surface. This takes us to what we call Sindhu, which was, a term that once existed before the time of Alexander the Great. And when he reached this place and colonized it, he basically put water in its place. He tried to put water in his place. He was defeated by rain eventually. I won't get into that. That is what the invention of rivers is all about. When I talk about Ganga's, Alexander's eye and Ganga's descent, he tried to make land conform, or I should say, tried to make a place conform to a land water surface and failed. But that surface has since been implemented. 2,000 years it has taken to implement a surface, and that surface is called India. So this is a wetness called Sindhu. Sindhu literally means ocean, but it is an ocean of rain. So it's a thickness from clouds to aquifers, So now you have basically two paradigms. On the one hand, you have India, on the other hand, you have Sindhu. Now we all, as designers, operate in India. That is the dominant paradigm. Government officials work with India. The international organizations work with India. Now this India is in trouble. This India is now facing sea level rise. It's facing erratic rains. It's facing storm events and so on. So what we say is, let us explore this other paradigm. Let us explore Sindhu, an ocean of rain, and ask, what does it offer? So we'll just show you a little glimpse, actually, of some of our work to bring out this wetness. I'll take you first to where we sort of begin our enterprise of exploring the ocean of wetness. And that is what we know to be Varanasi as a city on a river. What I want to suggest is that it is not necessarily a city on a river with water somewhere that drains water off the land, that is articulated by separation. That Varanasi is a Janapad in the Ganga. Janapad is a Sanskrit term that literally means foothold. Foothold, Jana, a foothold of people. Jana meaning people, Pada meaning foothold. So we talk about it as a foothold of people in a field of wetness. So it is a high ground. It's a high ground that appreciates wetness everywhere, that holds wetness and that engages the world through negotiation. So it does not have a geographic boundary as a city does, or even if a city does not want to acknowledge its geographic boundary, there is still something other than the city and something that is not urban. So there's always a dualistic sense to the city, whereas, or a binary sense. Here in the Janapad does not have an other. So I'll just take you through some of the drawings that we're beginning to explore. So now this is what we would call the riverfront today that everybody experiences when they go to a place like Varanasi. I call it the January face, the fair weather face of a city, that people really, sort of enjoy. They go there to be on the river, to see the face of the city, which is, which is claimed to be the oldest city in India. It's claimed to be a sacred city, and so on. So I just take you through it and then give you a sense, because we wanted you to get a sense of actually what that image is. But this is the January phase. If you go there during the monsoon, you don't get a chance to be on the river. But this is what you might, you might see in comparison, to the world of January. So on the right, you see January, the fair weather landscape. On the left, you see a moment during, you can say, it's not during the rains in the monsoon, but it is during the monsoon, when water has risen 50 feet in what we see as the river. So the left is basically what the river rising 50 feet. And then this is what happens. All the soil that has been deposited now by the river on these temples, the city is literally being excavated. And this happens every year. The city is defaced by the river. The city is defaced by the river, and it has to be, let's say, its fair weather landscape has to be brought to the surface. So this is Varanasi in wetness. This is what you might call a Janapad in an ocean of rain. What this does, it brings to the fore a whole other world that has been lost in Varanasi, and not just lost to physically, but lost by design as well in the imagination. And that is a world of tanks, of holding systems that hold rain, not just in ponds and pools and what are called kunds, but these are, it was held in fields, it was held in plants, it was held in jungle. What we call the jungle is not the forest. A jungle is a wetness that holds the monsoon. So 2,000 years ago, and I cannot get into this right now, but I can just assert it. 2,000 years ago, the waters of the river, the so-called river that we see, the Ganga, did not rise more than 3 to 5 feet. Today, it rises 50 feet, as you saw. And that is because we have lost all our holdings. We have lost all our jungle. We have lost the cloud forests. We have lost the tanks, the kunds, and that is to some extent what we are recovering over here as as another whole understanding that has moved. Instead of you have the riverfront, you have these tanks at the back. So they're really now what the city has turned its back upon. So the city has turned its back upon tanks, but it's also turned its back upon, or I should say holding systems, it's turned its back against the Janapad and holdings of rain. So so this is just a glimpse of what the exhibition might be. You know, it's this thing of how Varanasi is displayed. And this is really just one small exploration of one part of it. The other one is that we enter the streets. We often think the street as a land use, you know, and a land use that can be somehow controlled as a thoroughfare, you know, but this is a place of wetness. You know, the street is a place of wetness. So we explored that, and it's the multiplicity of the small. So working with an ocean of rain is to work with the multiplicity of the small, meaning the small raindrop, not the one systemic river. So you're working with a complexity and this thing of a holding system that, that people even today work with in the midst of being imposed upon, you know, by a map, by a river system, you know, by a geographic surface. They still manage to operate in Sindhu, you know, with wetness. And that's how they're able to, in fact, you know, survive a number of the disasters that befall India or befall a geographic surface. Even walls hold, you know, rain, you know, and so what we have designed today, I mean, what is being designed in Varanasi are glass and steel skyscrapers or glass and steel, you know, buildings that reject wetness. So everything we learn in architecture is about keeping wetness out, you know, and because we think they're keeping rain out. But if you look at walls in Varanasi, they hold a certain, they hold wetness, as you see in this sort of exploration video.
Did you finish, or are you still going? Oh,
we are still going. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess we have another 10 minutes or so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, you do.
Mm-hmm.
So wetness is everywhere in Varanasi. Yeah?
You know, because we've been working for so long in places like Mumbai, where, you know, which are actually sort of consumed by the monsoon, you know, much more than many places, you know, we have grown up or traveled in. We've been in the Sundarbans, and they seem, you know, literally wet. You know, we challenged ourselves to go to the desert, which is in northwest India, you know, the part of the map that you see, which has very little information on it, because, you know, people didn't map deserts because there were no, you know, rivers or sort of water bodies to talk about, and they were places of you know, exile. And desert was really, you know, a place to be left waste. And so, you know, to start thinking about desert as not being something dry, you know, we often say that there's no such thing as dryness. There's wetness everywhere. You know, the sea is very wet, and the desert is just less wet. It took us to Rajasthan, to the Thar Desert, which is a remarkable place of wetness. In fact, one is more aware of wetness there than anywhere else we have actually traveled. And, you know, when you look at one of, you know, a detail of this old map, you might be able to pick out the words saying sandy desert, little known to Europeans. And it was something that, you know, in terms of landscape that Dilip was saying, it didn't have the features that could be mapped, the entities, and was left sort of, sort of left alone for a long time. But today, you know, people are looking at deserts, you know, as waste that need to be made productive by adding water. And so this sort of being something lesser, we're finding environments like this, you know, canals which are coming from way across through major, you know, irrigation schemes which are drawing water from the Himalayas or the, you know, or even from the, I guess from Pakistan and other places. I mean, it's ridiculous to find rice being grown in deserts, because there is now, you know, they're being flooded with water, but also, you know, channels like the one you see on your right, which was an amazing swale which carried plants and animals and goats and wetness, you know, at various times of the year. You know, to sort of finally, you know, Europeans coming and trying to map. And the main thing the maps were really looking for was, where is the river? I mean, rivers are becoming something that without that we can't enter, rivers and mountains. We need those to anchor maps. And this little sort of, these lines that you see is something called the Luni, which is, translated in most texts as salt river. But Luni in itself means just salty, be salty. It's a quality. And we were fascinated, in terms of, sort of understanding, how did Luni become a salt river? And, what would it be to start looking at it as a unique wetness? So some of the journeys we did, we'll share with you. And when you look at this plain, there are goats over there, there's vegetation over there. Maybe in the monsoons, the wetness will, be there for a month, 2 months, 3 months. It'll hold in things, but it is in plants, it's in people, it's in animals. And, it's not even, it's not blue or brown at any other time of the year, but still we hold on to the line in the map that I showed you, even where there is no water per se. And so the whole imagination is geared to also, make embankments over here to try and hold water the whole year and pipe it from somewhere like hundreds of miles away in order to sort of create a river landscape. So our ideal is not only fair weather, but also river landscapes. So when we traveled through, the Luni, I mean, it was a remarkable place where there are many practices. There are dyers, printers, there are these migrating birds that come through, there are fairs that happen, in its terrain that have been going on for 500 years. And, it's salty, and it's, and there's a whole world of salt that sort of exists over here. And instead of working with staining literally over here, we were exploring sort of, other means, and, were really quite sort of involved with the, sort of the whole world of printing and block printing and the resist and the, the dye and the resist, and, thinking about wetness in relative terms and wetness that gets layered over time to start sort of, building some of these drawings that you're seeing here. So for us, Luni is, what you're seeing on your right is Luni seen as a river. And as Dilip was mentioning, to some extent as designers, we know that that's the imagination that's being built. And how do we start to work between these two worlds, between the ocean of rain and knowing that, the whole sort of development agenda is taking it towards a river. There are these remarkable places in the Thar, which are called orans. And again, many old texts from the 1700s to recent, ecologists and environmental scientists keep sort of struggling to sort of find a reference to it. And so it's called groves, it's called oases. And we found that, the moment you start using terms like grove and oasis, you start looking at these landscapes that are wide, hundreds of acres, 1,000 acres even, or could be just a lot, don't quite capture the sort of intensity of wetness that is continuous with the desert, in a sense that there's a moment where it just that, wetness intensifies. It intensifies in, animals that inhabit the area, certain, trees that are allowed to be here, and, all the invasives are sort of, through, practices of villagers and people who sort of are stewards of these landscapes, other sort of species are removed from here. And it's really not something which has boundaries in terms of an oasis when you think this is inside and this is outside. And so we've been sort of working with, traveling through these places, but also starting to just have some fun with these drawings to start thinking, how would we sort of think about wetness and think about some of these amazing trees, which are not isolated as root shoots. They, the wetness is actually continuing. And they support all these ecologies. And, in terms of the sort of the colonial sciences we have, absorbed, we have to think of them in terms of individual species. And having that sort of reality is also part of the world we inhabit. But how do we start to sort of deflect that? Know that, but deflect that through this sense of wetness that is much more ubiquitous rather than being, assigned to it. And so people don't even think about orans today as actually the primary holders of wetness in the desert. They think of them as just, endemic plants and animals. but these are actually holders of this unique sectional world that exists here. And if you travel, I mean, we were in an area called Barmer, and so the largest town there is a place called Jodhpur that is getting an overview from this fort that actually looks over this whole city. And what's fantastic is that the streets, I mean, another name for streets very often are gullies, but gullies are also drains, that they can be seen as swales or drains, which sort of, move wetness. And the whole hydrologic or sense of the world of Jodhpur is quite remarkable, how certain gatherings of holdings of wetness begin actually in the fort through these holding tanks, and actually were part of sort of this sectional world of the streets, which go right into the geology, to the sky, and, become part of these amazing tanks, which are completely thought sectionally, topographically, but not topography as sort of a given surface, topography that is actually made through this design vocabulary. So these drawings are, again, like in the others, trying to sort of build on this sort of, more of a seeing that is not necessarily always visual, but a sense of depth. And this is, walking down one of these gullies from the fort right down to the sort of the lower parts of Jodhpur, and starting to imagine, even the sort of what is the underbelly, which actually makes its infrastructure sort of work. And for us, these are still in progress. There's work even still happening on some of these drawings. And what you're seeing is, some just images of our studio where we're exploring, do we push the screen printing? Do we start working on it? How do we, build sort of other sort of modes of starting to think about wetness? It's, and again, as Dilip said, it's an analogous engagement with the paper or with the materials we are working with the screen, with the ink, with many of the materials that become part of this world. Yeah, and yeah, wait just once.
So I just want to end with where we began. I mean, and that is that, when we think about climate change today, I mean, one of the things that is really driving us quite to despair, I mean, is how people are blaming climate change for everything. Climate change is not the problem. It is really a design paradigm. Basically, it is a consequence. I mean, what we're facing today is a consequence of bad design. Design that began with the assertion of a surface to separate waters above from waters below in order to control water. And so what we want to encourage now and what we want to suggest, the only way to get out of the quagmire that we're in the long term, is to design with wetness everywhere, and to begin to critically assess and really begin to undo much of the damage that has been done by the paradigm of keeping water somewhere. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's very loaded presentation of many, many issues being brought up that I think are really, crucial to what we're trying to think about today in terms of relationships between, ecosystems and cities and so forth. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask about this. I've been recently working on a project, just very briefly, that is about the Colorado River lower basin, that is Hoover Dam down to the Salton Sea, which is arid land. It's desert land. And of course, there's now this tremendous problem of drought in the Western United States. And so basically what we've been asking is the question, what is drought? And so in a way, it's exactly the opposite of what you're talking about. because drought is the lack of water, you know, but it also turns out to be a sort of incredibly subjective idea that is, that you're only in drought if you don't have water rights. Yeah, if you have water rights and the water comes to you and somehow through the Colorado River, California has all the water rights. So it's a, so somehow the idea of water rights is governing the relationship of the Colorado River, the dam, the, you know, everything is being managed by sort of this legal capture of the water. So it's a very, and as you mentioned in a couple of places, I recognize that the river is a completely now artificial river. I mean, it's, in other words, completely managed. It's a very highly managed river. And as a result, it's basically dead below the dam, you know, and above the dam, it sort of looks like a river, and then it starts to look like something else, and it does weird things, and it doesn't flow, and all sorts of stuff, and it just trickles out before it reaches the end of its dump, you know. So it's an incredible, you know, recognition that the river is a linear construct, and that it and that the control, you know, in order to control it is absolutely right. And in order to hold the water, you actually destroy the river. You know, you turn it into a lake for a while, and then gradually that dries up, and then you don't have anything. So it's a very powerful sort of central principle that you're talking about the land by design. The design is, of course, the exercise of the line, you know, and linear thinking and so forth. So I think that that's really very, very seminal to so much of what's going on in cities and landscapes now. I was kind of intrigued with your remarks about a couple of things. One of them was representation, the way in which representation somehow fuels this, you know, with the map. And it takes a certain, I don't know which comes first, actually, the line or the power of, you know, the desire to control then produces the line, or the line actually produces the you know, now suddenly it becomes possible to control something. So I think that's I think it is, I would say it's like far older than you think or say, but I haven't done the research, so you may be exactly right. But it seems to me that ancient cultures have ways of differentiating the above from below. In other words, there's mythology, you know, the mythos of the sky and the ground is in almost every ancient society, I think, as not necessarily to do, you know, it was not necessarily geometries. And I think the geometry piece of it is central to what you're talking about. The way it becomes a system, a geometric system. The surface and the water are separated in a calculable way, as opposed to a mythical way or something. But I'd be interested to hear more about what you think about that, that question of whether that isn't just there from the beginning, you know. And I was struck by that. And I was also struck by how your sectional drawings as an alternative form of representation are using the lines, right? That the section is a line drawing. It's a line, you know, you're sort of doing this, or you're, you know, like this, or you're breaking things up with the line, and the line itself breaks at the same time. So I'm curious about that. And how you arrived at that representational sort of alternative to, you know, the map or whatever, the representational paradigm that you're trying to break. The other thing that came to mind, and this was also because of the Colorado River thing I've been interested in, which is the negotiation part of things. I'm sure water rights are negotiations, but you're actually talking about negotiation between land and water, or or are you talking about the sort of socio-political negotiations? Or how are you using that word? I'd be interested to hear more about that. I want to take a few more minutes and just also enter it. So those are kind of my main questions, but I wanted to come down on the side of land just before I quit my response, in the sense that you're absolutely right about the surface being, designed just as you said. But I think that the land-water relationship is not, I mean, why wouldn't it be about how land and water are working on each other all the time, incessantly? In other words, the water carves the land gets set, the sediment settles in the river, then new land emerges, and then and so forth. That these actually, the land, I understand about the line being the problem, but why does wetness have to be a sort of absolute description of what's happening, as opposed to this exchange, incessant exchange between land and water that are that would also bring up this wonderful idea of the loss of the holding reservoirs and the walls and the places that it gets held, is actually a land-water problem, not just a water problem, in a sense. It's, but I mean, of course, land holds wetness and water holds land in a funny way. I mean, it's not as if there isn't a bottom to the ocean or whatever it is. So I'm sort of wondering, I wanted to just say that because it's, because land appears in all your wetness diagrams in a certain sense, it has to. And so even no matter how much you smear it, it's sort of there. It has we can't get out of it. In other words, we can't get out of the surface. And that's, I know you said that actually, but I think it's really important to not just attribute it to imagination, as if imagination wasn't all tangled together. It's not like there's no such thing as a pure imagination. Anyway, that's my initial response. I don't know if Aisha wants to say something too, or whether you'd like to respond that and then have Aisha maybe ask her question, and so we can ask other questions then too.
I think I mean I would like to respond now. I mean, no, I think those are all very, very good points, but I want to clarify a few things. Yeah, I think, I mean, one is, I mean, if I can just take them at random, I've got them as, I've got them as 6 points here, but, and maybe Anu, you can pick up on I mean, one is that I think yes, many cultures have actually worked with an above and a below. I mean, and, I mean, if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you get a sense, of course, there's an above and below. But that is very different from saying above and below a surface. When you posit a surface, I mean, as Thales, of the school of Miletus did, he did it intentionally to actually have a ground that could be given a measure for observation. And that ground of observation also doubled up as a ground of habitation. So it wasn't intended to be a ground of habitation. It was asserted as a ground of observation in order to have a fixity in the midst of change, so that he could then assess change, and then change was given a measure of space and time, and then, you could figure it out. I mean, and that's how, he's called the father of science, so I think that there's a big difference between above and below a surface, so a surface is a geometric concept with no thickness. And that is something that to dwell on. The second is, yes, there are lines. There are, we use lines to write our alphabets. We use lines as gestures. We use all kinds of lines. What we are calling attention to is a particular line of separation, between land and water. That line is, the thickness of that line has been removed, and therefore it becomes invisible. So you see land and water meeting each other. Not, when you use the word across a line, that line now, be realized, it needs to be brought into to presence. And so you thicken that line, you give it an ecology, a zone, you call it an ecotone, et cetera, that is true. I mean, but that is a recognition of a line. Now, when we actually use line in sections, we're not using the same line of separation, so bear with that, the use of lines in terms of, the other thing about representation, is that, yes, we are very conscious as designers that we are making a transition from one paradigm to the other. We don't want to present an ideal world where we are looking only at one place. So in the case of Bombay and an estuary, Mumbai and an estuary, and its difference with an island, was that we were also changing the way we look at the past, because the past has been written on the ground of an island as if there was a separation between land and water. So when we write the past of Mumbai in an estuary, we are reworking, what you might, what might be taken for granted as facts in an island. We're bringing them into critique. So I think that here, when we talk about line and we talk about representation, we are very conscious. I mean, even in our use of the line, that it is open to critique, and that it is not something that we take for granted. And we are making a transition from a geographic surface to an ocean of rain. So we're not idealists that are just jumping into into a world that cannot be understood. The other point, I mean, the dynamic between land and water, that you say, is something that we can design with, that yes, we don't have to take it as static, and we have worked and we continue to work, with this recognition of the dynamism between land and water. But it only takes you that far. The dynamic between land and water, and it softens the land-centric paradigm by introducing water to a land surface, but it does not provide us an alternative to an imagination that enters history, that enters our understanding of indigenous people. Now, I've had interactions with legal scholars who have looked at Native Americans, and they say they don't come to the table to discuss surface water because they don't separate surface water from groundwater. That's the way we have to describe it, as surface water and groundwater. But what does it mean to actually understand them on their terms? When they don't make that separation at all, that means that they don't have a term for surface water. They don't have a term for groundwater. And I can give you any number of examples of situations where indigenous people cannot operate just by the dynamic of land and water. There is some other language that they're working with that needs to come to the foreground. So this is, for me, it is an act of, it is a social justice issue. It's not just climate change. It is about actually understanding people, not as a clash of cultures, not as a clash of languages, but a clash of the rain, of understanding the hydrologic cycle, of actually understanding rain versus rivers. So even today, when indigenous people are recognized for rivers, sort of rivers in history, that I feel is an ultimate victory of colonialism. That the native people are voicing now the language of the colonizers. In speaking of rivers as flow systems between lines. I think I should stop there. I would love to say something more about the Colorado River. I mean, I'll just say this one thing, and that is the Colorado River. I mean, as you rightly point out, is an engineered, masterpiece, a disaster, but what I want to say is that it was designed before it was engineered. It was designed and brought into being as a river, before it was engineered. And I just want to underscore that. And I think you mentioned, but I'm so glad you brought it up, because I think it's a classic example, I think, of how the invention of rivers has brought disaster upon the world.
Just quickly, I think the beginning of the surface was also the beginning, perhaps, of property. Do you think?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there is a whole.
That's when the land becomes property. Yeah, which is just an abstract sort of principle that floats on the top of the. Yeah, it's like the surface. It doesn't have any dimension. Yeah. And okay, Aisha, do you have something you'd like to say? And then we'll open to other questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to firstly thank you for sharing these projects. The work is so evocative and timely and relevant. I was really intrigued by the continually shifting temporality from the historical constructions of the past to the erratic experience of the present, and then the aspirations of the future. They all kind of weave in and out of each other. And they're explored then in different modalities through representation, cultural imagination, and lived reality. It really creates a rich field to parse through the problem or the solution of wetness. I was especially interested in those amazing collages and drawings. I think they create this kind of field condition, like it's broken up but continuous, and you can zoom in or zoom out and experience them at different scales. And I found that there was a hierarchy that was created by the concept of wetness everywhere, or the hydrologic cycle. So there's an embodied wetness in all things. And perhaps instead of like embodied carbon as a negative metric, we use embodied wetness as a way to add complexity and richness into the built environment and bring it into this cyclical ecology of wetness. A resilient urban fabric that flows with the water rather than resist it. I found that a really great thought. Less permanence, more informality, and flexible architecture. And I really loved how, I think more in your writing and a little bit right now, you talked a bit about the social justice aspect of this work, and what it means to embrace this ephemeral wetness for people who are living on the edges of that wetness, and water as a colonial subject. It really reminded me of Audre Lorde saying, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We really need to shift that paradigm and that thought. So how do we bring this from this hypothetical reality, from a hypothetical into a reality, and how do we do it in a way that's sensitive to the communities on the edge of the water? You point out in your writing that there are people engaging with wetness in ways that are not in the academic imagination. People from across disciplines and from outside the world of design or academia can be involved in the production of this wet world. And how do we involve those, and how do we work with those that bear the brunt of climate disasters? I grew up in Pakistan experiencing the monsoon, and it's a truly immersive experience. There's a sound, a smell, but I realized I experienced it very different from those in a less privileged position who experience it as kind of a devastation to their infrastructure, that they've been let down by land-centric infrastructure. So those are just a bunch of thoughts, but I guess my main question is, how do we involve those communities that are at the edge, and bring your work and those amazing sections into a concrete architecture, I guess a not concrete architecture maybe.
It's, if I could just sort of reflect on something which we've often talked about and thought about, maybe since the last, I guess over 5 years, when, maybe even 10, when the whole climate conversation was just starting. And I remember when there had been a couple of disasters, and I think it was maybe Katrina and others, in which, we would always wonder as to why people were not running to Bangladesh and other places to get their advice on how to deal with these, high and low, low wetnesses that we now call, and we have to run to the Netherlands. And so, and it's always that these people you're talking about were seen that they needed the handout of engineering while they actually knew perfectly well how to live in it. And so it's been, in a way, made a disaster. And, in their minds and literally in their lives, people who knew how to inhabit it are now put into severely dangerous situations by the kind of infrastructure that has been imported into those places in a very, very direct way. It's happening as we speak. We've traveled through the Sundarbans, through Bangladesh. I haven't traveled through Pakistan, but there are infrastructures being built in the desert of Rajasthan where we were, just before COVID, and it's just disastrous. And so for us, it's now not. It's less about saying that do they become representative than we have represented, just people, token people who are part of it. But so we as designers feel that we are actually sort of drawing from a certain commonsensical understanding when we, let me back up. And it might respond a little bit to Catherine's sort of question on wetness, is that when we think of wetness, we're not only talking about H2O. We feel that there's wetness in so many things, in plant materials and other things. And, in many lectures, Dilip loves to say that, a cucumber is what, how many % wet?
90 something.
Now 90. And, I can quench my thirst having a cucumber or having, some, agave in the desert rather than having to have a plastic bottle of water. And so, wetness has many, many, ramifications. And so we don't think that trees are holding water, but that, a certain, cagery, which is a proper noun for a particular, let's say common noun for a tree, is wetness in itself. And in terms of designers, it gave us a much wider language of what intervention and what materials actually mean. So, as an architect, so there's wetness in all materials, and how does one start to engage it differently? So, there is a whole question. And so I think, from engaging people and finding the people who are not speaking the language of the last developer who came, because we have actually sold our souls to the kind of money that is coming into these places. So just getting a representative Bangladeshi or a representative Pakistani or a person from the community is not enough. We have to actually listen to what's being said and listen to what even anthropologists are writing in those places, very well-meaningly. They are couching it in the language of levees that, because there isn't an imagination that there could be anything else. So in a very practical, down-to-earth way, we have found that even this idea of fingers of high ground that we had started to think about in Norfolk has a lot of possibility in Bangladesh, as a way of inhabiting and as a way of working, which is not about holding islands and trying to hold certain, areas. But I think the question we might want to also, because you said many things, is about the question of representation, if we can just come back to that. And I just wanted to sort of go back to something I think Dilip mentioned in the talk, that more and more, when we say representation, it seems that it's something that is known, and we are just trying to find a technique of representing it, something that is known, it's defined already. And so we more and more say that we are presenting something. So through the work, we are actually trying to uncover it, dig it, discover it. It's not something that we've already kind of figured out. So the process of working and the process of building these exhibitions, the process of doing a project is very important in this. And so, I don't know if you want to add to that question.
Yeah, one of the things that you say is that, it's not about interpretation, it's not about different views of the same thing, but it is really about the possibility of different things. So people don't see the same thing differently, they see different things, So that sense of going beyond representation in order to make something come into being, or allow something to come in. I'm going to use the word discovery, I think what we find most enjoyable about what we do, and so it's really a speculative work, but to bring people onto the ground of speculative work is sometimes to provide them with maybe a release, particularly people who are suffering injustice, and beginning to see that the language that is being deployed, even at the climate, in Glasgow, is not their language, and that is what we find to be quite tragic. But we're exploring the possibility that maybe this is their language, and that we could learn something from them,
The one thing that couldn't be represented, in the perspectival, when perspective was invented, was the sky. And what had to happen was they had to just put a mirror, on the drawing that reflected the sky, so that, because it couldn't be represented in the perspectival model. And so it was like, so it's, in a way, the representation of the sky is impossible, at some level, but it's also, you have to, the atmospherics of it are elusive, incredibly elusive. So it's a really interesting project, I think, in every way for that reason as well. Are there other questions on the chat? I didn't see any questions, but maybe there are some.
We haven't had any questions come in yet with the chat, but please, I want to invite everyone, if you'd like to add a question in the chat or raise your hand. We have a few more minutes. Maybe I'll just quickly say, one sort of theme, of course, fundamental in the lecture series is the role of the colonial. And of course, in thinking about, I think when we were just discussing, the relationship between land and property, and, when you were speaking about controlling the sea, I was thinking of, the British ports, building of the ports in Bombay, and that, and all of the infill projects where, those islands were becoming a city is a direct reflection of that sort of imperial project of controlling the sea and the trade that moved through the colonial period and then today as well, with ports, of course, in India, but also Sri Lanka and other parts of South Asia. And so it's really, I think, an important something that has come up again and again is the colonial past, the colonial present, but also a resistance to that past and present, and openings to a future that that moves in a different way. Maybe if we think about the last 400 plus years, starting with the East India companies, and really charts a different trajectory. So we only have a few minutes, but I was particularly curious just to maybe hear a little bit more about the colonial and species. Anu, you had mentioned this, and of course with the sort of colonial project to categorize. And so I thought perhaps that's what you were sort of speaking of, a critique of that categorization, but it would be wonderful to hear more.
Yes, I mean, it comes in everything. I think our whole education and beginning from geography, and I think this is something Dilip actually elaborates a lot in Invention of Rivers. It's fascinating how that we actually, there's a whole, and we think that how else can it be? That if we don't separate, if we don't categorize, there is no way of knowing things. So there's a whole world of science, of enlightenment that is sort of based on it. And in some ways, I guess you take it back to Alexander, which is 2,500 years before that it was already happening there when they were sort of inventing the first world map. And so it's so embedded in what we do that it's not that we feel we can step outside of it, but we can tussle with it simultaneously. So and that's really something that is, what we are, why we feel the whole practice of working. It's not only about thinking, but I think you very rightly said that. So it's not only taking the history we are given, but as designers, we don't just take what the anthropologist, the historian has handed over to us, whether we are looking at the ancient of cities called Varanasi or we are looking at Mumbai. We just didn't start with the sort of island city imagination that there were 7 islands which got filled up, which despite a lot of what we've written and said seems to not be suppressed as the imagination. And so it became really important as a designer to actually start to relook at some of that representation itself and say that, have we had a mindset that we've read them wrongly, that there were actually maps that we could have read differently, and where did the shift start to happen? Where did the line start to harden and the vocabulary harden? So we've been sort of, open to that, and that allows us to actually project into the future, so it doesn't stop over there. And I don't know if you're wanting to jump in, yeah.
Well, if I can just say, address your the colonialism aspect of your question. The tragedy of post-colonialism is that they use the same representations that the colonizers used, and the map is a classic example, and so that is really one of their tragedies. And so when we look at, questioning, the possibility of, of questioning these representations that have furthered colonialism. We are questioning actually the ground to which a word has corresponded, in the native language. So here, if I had to put it in a nutshell, this is why we say that India is not the land that was colonized. India was the colonizer, and has been the colonizer of Sindhu, and so the people that we are really talking about are the people of Sindhu, not the people of India. The people of India continue to be educated people like us who are really the colonizers, because we are using geography. And so we have gone down to questioning the post-colonial language as really the language of colonialism, of colonialism that goes back to Alexander, and so to really get a release from that longue durée, we find that, like in the case of Bombay, for example, to question the island, to question the notion of an island and to posit an estuary in place of an island is to really question the very basis of representation, as to what the word, the referent of the word, is questionable now, at least to us. And that is what we say is the language of landscape. So this book, Ocean of Rain, and the exhibition really is calling into question the language of landscape as the colonizing language of the day, and the landscape architect as possibly the carrier, the ultimate carrier actually of colonialism, in our world today. Unless now we start questioning, and going beyond the language of landscape, so.
Which might be interesting and a little shocking to, us saying this, because I know that you guys are starting a landscape program, and the landscape architect does hold the high horse that, okay, we know about environment and, others don't. But we find that that language can be as, disabling in places where we are, even the way ecologies are being defined, that we are actually bringing a very, strong colonialism. And just, as one beef we have is that, the whole world, now any city, if I come back to cities, which is a conversation we started with Katherine, maybe before this talk began, that, you can't be a world-class city if you don't have a waterfront. So places in India, in Asia are constructing rivers because they don't have a riverfront. And that's where landscape architects are running to, to design. And that's what, we create this confrontation. So how do we look at some of those projects which seem to be the do-gooding projects, but might carry a lot of, we may be suppressing ways of being and living that we just haven't seen.
It may be interesting just to throw this in, but that the Native American tribes hold have senior rights to water rights. This was a treaty that was in, the early 20th century, when they thought the water was never going to run out. So they thought that was okay. They could compensate the Native Americans with water rights, and they would never, wouldn't matter. And now it matters greatly. And so they're the ones who own the water right now. So it's an very interesting way it gets flipped, because it is a sort of mimicry, game, where everybody, the colonizer, they're colonized, they're all, yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So are there other questions from the, not a question, but
no
Addison, do you want to make a comment? Adele, Addison?
I think my connection, is too choppy for me to do that. But thank you again for this great material. This is such fascinating ways of looking at these landscapes.
Okay.
Well, I was just, I guess my comment then would just be, as I said, that I find it so interesting that the mapping and non-mapping of the deserts and the treatment of them as wastelands, because they're not, they don't have use value or they don't have market value, right? And the sort of running irrigation canals through the desert to turn it into something else through the introduction of this like engineered wetness, which is obviously very different. And just how much that is sort of, it's mirrored by wetlands, which were also viewed as wastelands because they were not productive in the sense, and many have been lost in the same kind of developmental strategies that, for example, have wiped out the wetlands that used to completely surround New York and New Jersey, and the various climate management problems that now emerge out of that loss of wetlands to hardscape. I think there's something, obviously it's not to say that they're just mirror images of each other, desert and wetlands, but I do think there's something to these different spaces that have been viewed as waste and as disposable. So yeah, there's thoughts that were brought to mind by this fascinating and terrific presentation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. One of the things that we have discovered actually in the process of researching this and setting up this ground, as it were, of speculation, is that in the act of let's say articulating a fair weather landscape, we have defined a normal. We have defined the normal and then accordingly defined the abnormal. So when we talk about deserts and wetlands, like you say, I mean, because we have looked at the Mississippi, I mean, the tragedy actually of people coming across the Atlantic, being given property over here, and then they come and they find just wet stuff. They ask like, where is our land? Where is our piece of land? We were given land and we bought this land. And they discover they've not bought anything, but they have bought actually to some extent a latitude and longitude, a piece that can be now articulated, and then they can go and recover it. I mean, you can go and reclaim it or fill it and, and get it. But that sense of actually demeaning these landscapes, I mean, and desert is just an amazing one, for the wilderness, ideas of wilderness and waste, I mean, and really stems from the idea of waste, and to then start making them productive on the basis of making them into land. I think that is our point, actually, that the engineering actually is a second act. The first act of design has passed largely unnoticed, and so by situating them against a normal, we've laid the groundwork for their engineering, and this is why we are trying to see whether we can design or come up with another vocabulary. So even in the desert idea, the desert is a bad word. I mean, like the N word. I mean, it's going to become a bad word very soon. And these are. I mean, I don't understand why we do not. It's like we say. When is water going to have a Me Too movement? It's like, when is the desert going to have a Me Too movement, and begin to see that it has been demeaned by some comparison with the normal or land and this land-centric domination that is sort of set up its demeaning. But yes, I mean, I would think that that's a nice thing that you brought up, that both these, they seem at other ends, but they are both, from the land-centric point of view, waste.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation. I think we're at the end here of this great event that you generously came to and gave us your work. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for coming. And we learned a lot today.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Laura and Aisha and everybody else who's here. It's always exciting for us to sort of, keep sort of finding ways to open this conversation with different sets of people and to, come across you again somewhere and to be able to pick up the conversation.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. And, it's unfortunately that this is, a Zoom, and the moment we click, we're all in our own worlds.
Yeah, we disappear.
Very different from the lingering or the drink we could all get in,
I know.
Down.
It has to happen that way soon, I think. Yeah.
We really miss that. And, maybe there will be another opportunity to do that. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I know. I agree.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. So goodbye. I guess we're leaving.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.